So here is another question about law. This one comes from Timothy. Is there a clear principle that can be used to know which Christian ethics one should strive to be made into laws and which ones should be left out of the law?
Well, I don't know classically if kind of these details have been worked out. I suspect to some degree they have, but I'll tell you what comes to mind, and that is the common good. The reason that we have a legal system is to promote, to use the language of the Constitution, the general welfare, I guess is the way they put it in the preamble of the Constitution. Well, there, the welfare, general welfare, is synonymous with the common good. We are trying to use a system of law that is meant to promote human flourishing in the broad sense, the common good. And so I think this can be a guideline. And by the way, there are going to be differences of opinion even on that, but it's a place to start, it seems to me. This is going to be a guideline. Is this thing that we're enacting into law really meant to serve the common good, or is it meant to serve a parochial interest, that is the interest of a smaller group of people, and particularly at the expense of the common good? So, that's the kind of principle that I think of right now. And the notion of how the law ought to be used, even for that purpose, is going to shift depending on an individual's political philosophy. So the common good might be viewed as individual liberty. So individuals get the liberty to pursue their own life and to set their own goals and kind of build their own utopia, so to speak, for themselves, according to within boundaries, of course, but according to their particular interests and desires and views. So that would be a political philosophy that emphasizes more individual liberty, which is the principle that was grounded, that our own American experiment was grounded in, at least in part. Or you have a collectivist view. What will promote the good of everybody as a collective whole? Now, that's a much more leftist perspective. Okay, and this is the concern that you have in communist countries. It's not the individual; it's the collective, and the government then is going to build a utopia for the collective, but that is based on what the individuals in the government understand utopia to look like. So, one's conviction that you use ethical principles in law for promoting the common good is going to be dependent on your understanding of what the common good looks like. And that's going to be rooted in larger worldview issues and a deeper understanding, or a particular understanding, of what it means to be human. So as a follower of Christ, I'm looking at the ethics of the Bible as God's way, as the designer of everything, of accomplishing human flourishing. And so I am going to be looking for those kinds of things that are best for the society, in particular more individual liberty as opposed to collectivist mentality, which I think leads to abusive policies and a violation of individual liberties, and how any particular Christian ethic is going to relate to that. But if somebody who's way over on the political left, who sees the world in Marxist terms and sees not equality of what's the right language here, of where you start, so to speak, as opposed to equality of
outcome.
As opposed to equality of outcome, yeah. So American project was, let's all have kind of an even playing field as much as possible so that we can move forward at our own speeds according to our own desires, okay? That's one sense of equality. Another sense of equality is not equality of opportunity, but an equality of outcome. Everybody's got to land at the same place, and that's Marxist. So that's going to dictate different policies and different. Now I'm pausing here and even actually physically doing scare quotes around different ethics. And the reason I'm doing that is because the political left has no actual grounds for ethics, since they tend to be non-theistic in their convictions and individualistic in their desires. So it's ironic because they campaign for individual liberty. Maybe I'm getting off topic a little bit. I'll just make this observation. They campaign for individual liberties. I want to do what I want. You do you. Expressive individualism. We talked about this before. But politically, they're collectivists. They're using political power to force a point of view and a way of doing business on everybody, and more and more aggressively as time goes on. But anyway, so the answer is vague, or I have a formal principle. Okay, use ethics and enforce certain parochial ethics, say so-called Christian ethics, for the common good, but those terms in a material fashion are going to work out in very different ways depending on your political philosophy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think what you said is true. I think people have thought about this probably a lot more than we have because that's their field, so people can look into this more. But I want to add that, if you're looking for a principle of which should be made into laws and which ones should not be made into laws, I think one simple distinction here could be the type of laws at the beginning of the Ten Commandments versus the type of laws at the end. So the first 4 laws are all about worship. They're about how to worship God. They're about worshiping God above all other gods. And the last 6 are about relationships in society so that you can have a just society. So those are I think that's the important distinction to start with. We are not going to pass laws about how you should worship God. That's not the role. It's not even possible in our country. Now, with the Old Testament, obviously that was the purpose of their country. God was supposed to be their sovereign, so that was a different situation. But in our country, that's not how it works. So we are not going to pass laws about how to worship. But the other laws about basic parts of morality, of justice, of not harming people, of just the whole moral system, I don't think there's anything wrong with people voting for what they believe to be right and wrong. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's what everyone does. And there's no neutral moral worldview. So if it's wrong for Christians to vote according to their understanding of morality, then it's also wrong for people who are atheists.
That's right.
To vote according to their understanding of morality. And the fact is, it's not wrong. That's what every single law is an expression of morality. That's right. I mean, for the most part, unless it's a random thing like which side of the road the car is going to drive on.
No, but even that is a meant of organizing society for the safety of the individuals, for the common good.
Sure, but whether it's on the right side or the left side.
That's right.
But doesn't matter.
Right, on that particular.
Yeah. So every law is supporting an idea of morality. So there's nothing wrong with Christians as citizens in this country to express that. Now, there's also the question, so we have the question of the type of law, whether it's a law about worship or a law about societal relationships and contracts and that sort of thing. But there's also a question of the extent of the law, because we don't outlaw certain things like lying. It's not, unless it's in terms of perjury in a court case.
Right.
So there's a level of seriousness that is legislated against, but we don't have a utopian view where we can stamp out all sin. Mm-hmm. And I think we kind of have a sense for that. I don't know what the exact principle would be here, but the more you try to create a utopia and stamp out all sin, the greater the intrusion of the government. So there is a point where we're not going to legislate aspects of morality.
Well, that's right, because then you end up contravening personal liberties, which itself is a moral harm and creates moral harms. So this is where, as the law gets too intrusive, it creates problems, moral problems, and so even your definition or your sense of how intrusive the law should be is going to be informed by your own kind of moral sensibility. Marx said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So that's kind of a more historical way of saying the rich should pay their fair share kind of thing. But notice that that's all coming from an ethic, from Marxism. So there's no way to ground the goodness of that in a certain sense, because it's an atheistic system, Marxism. Nevertheless, it is an ethical viewpoint that they're trying to impose on the rest of the world. But that is going to interfere significantly with personal liberty, and that's what we've seen. And it does by nature. And so that's going to create another kind of harm in society. So you just can't get away from these ethical concerns, no matter how you choose to use power.
So the bigger the concern, the
more gravity of it.
The more gravity of it. For example, murder would be an example of that. That's a reason why we should legislate against it. And then as you move towards the sins that cause less damage, doesn't make them not sins. God is still going to judge us for it, but government's not in a place to judge certain things about our hearts or certain motivations or whatever that is.
Now, that's the problem with hate crime, by the way, but that's another issue.
So
that's a thought crime.
Yeah. Anyway, so with something like abortion, then obviously that if it's murdering an innocent human being, that is a major concern that is very legitimate to legislate against.
And by the way, that is not it's not a Christian ethic. It is a human ethic. It isn't parochial. It isn't like, oh, well, how do you baptize? Do you dip or sprinkle? This is about a basic human need, and this is why, regardless of religion, civil laws protect human beings, because they are convinced that human beings are the kind of beings that ought to be protected in a way that other animals are not protected, okay? And the question here is whether the unborn child, is an example of one of those valuable human beings, okay? So it's not a religious issue, though this is the way it's made to be. It's no more religious than it being wrong to murder, to commit homicide.
I think that's a great point, Greg. That is not something peculiar to Christianity. It's a publicly accessible moral principle that we accept in many other cases. You're just applying it to every human being. And of course, some would object that they don't think every human being should have protection. Some outright will say that.
Yeah.
And I've had atheists say that to me. So that's where we have to make our argument, and we have to convince people that this is actually true about reality, that we ought to be doing this.
Right. By the way, you said something of people, and we both made reference to people have kind of thought through this. I think it's in the Christian tradition that most of the careful thinking has been done, because there's a real concerted effort to try to make one's public policy and public life and understanding of the role of the use of power by the government conform to an objective external standard, God's standard. This is where just war theory comes in, that is all tied to transcendent morality. Where does transcendent morality inform policy? But if you don't believe in transcendent morality, something else is going to be informing it. And so from an atheistic worldview or a naturalistic world or a de facto atheistic worldview, people may not be entirely atheists, but they function as if they were, then there's a whole other thing that's informing it. And a lot of it is just self-interest, a massive amount of self-interest. And that's why the appeal is made by politicians regarding some of these things merely to self-interest and not to any deeper ethical principles. So I think when we survey the field of the careful thinking that's been done to try to answer this question of how do we integrate ethics properly into policy. That thinking is principally done by people of spiritual conviction, especially theistic people, especially Christian theists. And you're not going to get that kind of depth from the secular world. They're guided by something entirely different.